Good evening. Welcome back to the second night of the 2021 Nau Center Signature Conference. I'm Caroline Janney, and I'm delighted to invite you to join us this evening. I'd like to give a special thanks again to Will Kurtz, Kevin Caprice, and Brian Newman for all of their technical support behind the scenes. We couldn't have any of our Zoom webinars without all of their expertise. If you missed last night's presentation, that will be available. We have a recording of that Will Kurtz will make available, and you can also find it on Facebook. Closed captioning is available tonight, and you should be able to just push the button on your Zoom controls and find that. Tonight, we are going to have a panel discussion with three experts on the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and the African American experience during the Civil War. At the end of our conversation, we will answer some of your questions. So again, please use the Q&A button to ask questions, and we will try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. And because it's a panel discussion, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists before we get started. And I'd like to start with Emmanuel Dabney. Emmanuel Dabney is a graduate of Richard Bland College, the University of Mary Washington, and UNC Greensboro. He has been employed by the National Park Service at Petersburg since 2001. He believes that his love of history is embedded in his DNA, having on his maternal grandmother's line ancestors who were slaveholders and free Blacks, on his maternal grandmother's line enslaved people and non-slaveholding whites, and on his paternal line more enslaved people. Welcome, Emmanuel.
Thanks so much, Carrie.
I'd also like to introduce Amy Murrell Taylor. Professor Taylor is the T. Marshall Hahn Jr. Professor of History at the University of Kentucky. She is the author of Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War Slave Refugee Camps, which we are proud to say won the John Nau Book Prize for the best book written in 2019. She is also the author of The Divided Family in Civil War America, and co-editor with Michael Perman of Major Problems in Civil War and Reconstruction. Amy is a proud graduate of the University of Virginia, where she received her PhD in 2001. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And finally, we have with us Professor Holly Pinheiro. Professor Pinheiro received his doctoral degree in 2017 from the University of Iowa. He is currently an assistant professor at Augusta University in the Department of History, Anthropology, and Philosophy. His manuscript, The Family Civil War, is under contract with the University of Georgia Press in the Uncivil War series, one of the series co-editors being Professor Taylor, who's with us. He's also the co-editor with Latrice Donaldson and George White Jr. in the Black Soldier in War and Society, New Narratives and Critical Perspective series with UVA Press. He is currently researching a new project that will focus on African American empowerment at Camp William Penn during the war. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to this opportunity.
Wonderful. So I want to also take this opportunity to thank the panelists for agreeing to come back. We were supposed to have this panel in person last March, and for obvious reasons, we are doing it on Zoom this spring. And I want to thank all of them for graciously and so generously agreeing to join us in this format. Things are going to be a little bit different tonight. What we're going to do is I'll ask some questions and I'll direct them at certain people, but then I hope that all the panelists will join in so that we can make this as much of a conversation as possible. But I'll start with you, Emmanuel. If you would just give us some background on the USCT, why they organized, when they organized, things of that nature.
Sure. So it's very interesting, been just sort of thinking about our conversation, and I think it's very important, and I always say this whenever I'm talking about U.S. colored troops to people who, whether they are, people who love the Civil War or just coming upon the Civil War, that we start with what U.S. colored troops are not. And I know that some people don't like to start there, but I think it's easier to start there in this case. They are not Buffalo Soldiers. That always just sends a chill down my spine when people say, "Oh, you mean the Buffalo Soldiers?" Not quite. So if you're thinking about that, that's not what they are. These regiments that get nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers are not formed until the sort of immediate aftermath of what we think of as traditional Civil War. Not that they are not Civil War veterans in those units, because they certainly are. But this idea of Black men enlisting in the United States Army really started at the beginning of the Civil War. And we just commemorated virtually, as everything is right now, the inauguration of the Civil War in April of 1861. And it's not long after that Black men volunteer to serve in the United States military, and they are rejected. And this really stems from late 18th century law that prohibited Black men from serving in militia units throughout the northern, and as the country progressed westward, those states as well. These prohibitions, of course, existed in the South as well. The idea of forming Black regiments gets a hold in 1862 through David Hunter, Union general, who is occupying coastal South Carolina, Georgia, and he issues a proclamation of his own freeing people in 1862. That does not go over well in Washington, D.C., where President Lincoln and the War Department are not pleased with General Hunter. Nevertheless, by November of 1862, he has formed a regiment of people who had been left behind in the coastal region as the slaveholders retreated and became wartime refugees. These people had largely been left behind. And this unit became the first South Carolina colored volunteers, African descent, not to be confused with the white Confederate soldiers. And almost at the same time, many, many miles away, the senator from Kansas, James Lane, had formed a regiment out there. Sorry, there's a thunderstorm here. But he had formed a regiment out there, the first Kansas Colored Volunteers. So these are the first two regiments. They see, at least first Kansas, will see some action in October of 1862. But it's with the Emancipation Proclamation, the finalized version that's released on January 1st, 1863, that for all of the shortcomings that it did have, for all of the time and energy that people spend picking it apart now, there had been no president prior to Abraham Lincoln to put in writing welcoming Black men into the US military. He did not anticipate probably that they would be as intensely engaged in combat as many units ended up being. But it was a shift, and it was a dramatic shift. And I think it's part of the Emancipation Proclamation that most people ignore for whatever reason. And some people have their own agendas as to why they stop reading at a certain point. But these units are organized in 1863 through the end of the war with white officers and Black non-commissioned officers and privates.
So I want to kind of integrate some of the story that's going on at the same time here. And so I'll turn to Amy and ask about if we have these early efforts that Emmanuel has spoken of in as early as 1861 of enlisting or arming African-American men. What's going on in the South with enslaved people at this moment as white Union soldiers in particular start to show up in various parts of the South?
Sure. And I think Emmanuel made a really important point that's always worth repeating, which is that the Emancipation Proclamation was not the beginning of the story of what we're talking about tonight. And in fact, the story begins at the very beginning of the war. And so, yes, very opening days of the war, we see enslaved people who look out at the Union Army and see a potential ally in the destruction of slavery, with an emphasis on potential, because it's not exactly known, but there is potential. And what's really striking is just in the first few weeks at Union installations in the South, Fort Pickens, Florida, Fort Monroe, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., enslaved people start fleeing, just on this hope that this is indeed an ally that can help bring down the institution of slavery. And so they start to flee and they seek protection from the army, and what that means is they are seeking protection from being returned to slavery, but they're also seeking what they need to start building a new life outside of slavery. So the very basics of survival: food, shelter, and, as some of the earliest refugees argue, an opportunity to work for the US Army. And I say it like that because, of course, the really pivotal moment in this story comes about 6 weeks into the war, and it's in Virginia, and it's at Fort Monroe. After weeks of people running away and being turned back by the United States, here we have at Fort Monroe a group that arrives and makes the argument that if you allow us to work for the Union, that is going to not only damage the Confederacy and damage their war effort, but potentially enhance the Unions. And it's Union General Benjamin Butler who goes along with this reasoning and issues his famous order saying that any enslaved people coming into the line should be protected as contraband of war, as seized enemy property, which is the way, of course, that he justifies it legally. So an important order that opens up Union lines, and we begin to see wherever the Union Army is going, enslaved people start to flee. But of course, it's an order that is still classifying people essentially as property. It's not granting freedom right away. But that is the beginning of the story. And, just as Emmanuel said, there are those who want to fight right away and they can't, but they do go and work as laborers for the army. And so there's the beginning of this relationship between formerly enslaved people and the army at this moment.
And I think that's a really important point worth stressing, is that all of the Black men and women who are supporting the Union Army aren't necessarily doing so in the capacity of soldiers.
Right. And I think we need to shine more light on that. Absolutely. That, there's thousands of people who are working as heavy laborers for the army. They're digging trenches, they're building roads, they're burying bodies. They're working as cooks, they're working in hospitals, and a really important labor force that, the Union command is basically saying, well, this will free up more white men to go serve in combat. So really important, beginning of the story of Black enlistment.
And so, Emmanuel, I'll shift back to you. Thinking about as those units more and more of those units start to organize, can you talk a little bit about why they're called USCT units? While we still have the 54th, the 55th Massachusetts, we have a handful of those state units. Could you explain that just a bit?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's very important that there are state regiments, the governors of certain states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, are going to get these state organized regiments, or volunteer regiments that are organized within the state with the approval of the War Department. So Governor Andrew in Massachusetts gets 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments. 54th Massachusetts, of course, gets a lot of notoriety from the movie Glory. Everyone likes a good Denzel movie. But the majority of these regiments that are formed are going to be known as United States Colored Troops. And of course, there are different levels of soldiers during the war: infantry, men who are marching with long rifles, cavalry, generally mounted, and then the artillery units. And they are heavy artillery units, big cannon, usually in heavily fortified places that don't easily move. The cannon don't easily move. And then there's light artillery, which teams of horses will move these guns around to different locations. And so those troops, those United States Colored Troops, are really going to be the people who are opening up a new window here into Black military service in this country, as they are not volunteers from states, but these are Black men who will be either volunteering or being drafted or being substitutes for white men in other units, to serve on behalf of the United States. And I think that this is an important note, that the Civil War is going to bring to a fore the issue of Black people who demanded to be considered citizens of a country that had just a few years before, through its Supreme Court, through the Chief Justice of that court, articulate that people of African descent, people look like me, my ancestors who were living at the time, were never intended to be citizens of the United States of America. But Black people already believed that they were citizens of this country. And we can see the patriotism in how they named their newspapers, how they volunteer to support this cause, even before Black men could get involved. To Amy's point, that there are Black men and women who will be doing work for the United States government throughout the war, principally through working in different locations as laborers, as laundresses, as teamsters, as blacksmiths. There's just so much work that is happening that we don't think about often. We think about the war, it's the troops and who killed who and the generals and who said what. But with these United States colored troops are demonstrating a need to be considered citizens, a need to be free if they had escaped from slavery, and a need to be a cohesive sort of front to a country that had said that they did not fully recognize them as people.
And I'm thinking about Professor Barron's point last night, looking specifically at the men who were born in Albemarle County who ultimately fought for the USCT, that they're coming from all over the place, even though their origin story was Albemarle. And I want to bring Holly into the conversation here and talk a bit about where some of these men are coming from. Your work is focused on Philadelphia.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit about who those soldiers were that you write about?
I mean, I've also just, both of y'all have made some really excellent points that I just wanted to piggyback off of real quick. And for me, when hearing Emmanuel and Amy's points about what's happening for enslaved people, or even people who are free in enslaved states, because that is reality for many people, is that Northern African Americans, even though I specifically focus in Philadelphia, I have also previous research that looks in New York City, and the same thing is happening there. They're very aware of what's happening in the early parts of the war, and there's a lot of resentment on the lack of opportunities to serve. In many cases, they're being violently put down as they try to form informal militias. So there is in the Black press, whether it's the Christian Recorder or the Weekly Anglo-African, where they're making these calls saying, why should we serve if the call ever actually comes? What is it? And to Emmanuel's point, which was being reiterated many times over, is we are citizens. We pay local and state taxes, but yet our children can't even go to schools in Philadelphia or New York City, or the schools they go to are inadequate unless we're talking about the Institute for Colored Youth, which, as a plug, somebody should do a book on that school because it's extremely phenomenal. So with my work and the pensions, and even to the point of what Dr. Barron said yesterday, is the pensions are phenomenal as ways to really examine the soldiers, the veterans, but really their families and communities. I love pension records. For me, looking at Philadelphian-born USCT soldiers, because I initially thought I was going to talk about their conversations about the 14th, 15th Amendment, like these big policies, or even being involved in Lee's surrender. But what came across to me is they're talking about their families, unemployment issues, where they went to school, are their children in school, are they having marital discord? And I learned a lot of deep conversations about their intimate lives in ways that were truly amazing. So, I mean, the pensions are great for community, for group studies, for family studies. And I think they're absolutely great. And for Philadelphia, I think that bringing the freeborn experience into the conversation really complicates the public discourse today about the USCT experience, because we are so focused on Glory, which is a great film, and I can quote it word for word, which is sad to admit. But it's I think of the people that are usually represented are people like Denzel's character and Morgan Freeman's character who were freed. And Thomas is just like the free person, is what is like one of the story, but he has a family. He had hopes and dreams, and they matter as he's fighting for his own, and his family's fighting for their own battles of racial equality and social justice in cities, in states where slavery was abolished, but that doesn't mean equality surfaced or full citizenship materialized. And that comes through in the pensions.
Yeah, that's one thing that Professor Varon stressed quite a bit last night. And one of the things that our project has revealed is the various ways in which this affects families. And Holly, I'd like you to elaborate a bit on some of the examples that are happening in a northern city like Philadelphia. And then maybe Amy, you could speak to what's going on in the refugee camps that are similar and yet different.
I mean, I was also just, I strongly encourage y'all to go back and watch if you didn't see yesterday's event, because I was very captivated with what Professor Warren was saying about her project and the families, and using these narratives to tell the deeper story. Because for me, I love using Philadelphia because it's so well known in American history, not just for the Civil War era, but during the Civil War era, it was pivotal for wartime mobilization. You have prominent political organizations, you have the governor, even to Emmanuel's point about the influence of state governors. Andrew Curtin was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln, and there's also concerns at certain points about Lee's invasion into Gettysburg and potentially even like going farther into Philadelphia and other places. And for me, looking at Philadelphia, really, and particularly Philadelphian-born African-American soldiers and their families, particularly from 1850 into the 1930s, I walked away with such a complicated understanding of their families as they're constantly fighting against racial discrimination, whether it's as children and limited access to schools, whether it's occupational employment issues, whether it's trying to get into the military, the struggles that they deal with in the military. Because one thing we know the story, for example, when talking about the 54th or soldiers tearing up their paychecks because they see it as a disrespect of their manhood. But what does it mean for those families who aren't getting that money? And when we even talk about desertion, and we talk about it, through a gendered and racial component, what if we add in the family and in freeborn places where they're saying, come home? Philadelphia, as Judith Giesberg, as Matt Goldman, and many others have already shown, even Du Bois done it with the Philadelphia Negro, which is a great book, is talking about the hardships of life for African Americans in Philadelphia for the 19th and early 20th century. And you see it in the pensions. And I will spoil a piece of the book, which hopefully Amy won't get mad about. But one of the things that blew my mind when I was reading the pensions, well, there are two, was in 1884, Benjamin Davis, unfortunately, he will die as a prisoner of war because he refuses to dig a ditch as a POW. But his widow in 1884 will say to the pension agent, you took everything away from me, you meaning the Union Army, like my family has dissolved. What do we have to show for it? And it was like that question stuck with me, and her demands for recognition for what their family lost needs to be in conversation when we talk about the commemoration, or even Hillary Green with living monuments of these veterans. It's not so positive when we add in the families who've lost everything. And it's a more complicated story when we talk about people who were never enslaved or the first generation freeborn of their families in a place like Philadelphia. That needs to be in conversation with Amy's excellent book, which I cite and use all the time. But together, hopefully there's this deeper conversation of the family struggle during the Civil War era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll just pick up there. I appreciated last night how family was such a central thread. And I think the whole project, Black Virginians in Blue, I really appreciate how it's not just extracting the soldiers and studying them individually, but seeing them in their family context for all the reasons that you're talking about here. I mean, soldiering was very much not just something that affected families, but was really experienced by families, arguably. And that's especially true when we head south and look into these refugee camps, where, yes, there are sites of where families are coming together. Sometimes they're reuniting. Sometimes these are places where families that have been separated by the slave trade are coming together, or people are hoping but that by going to this place, they might get information and might be able to come together with family. So it's that, but it's also, these are places that are, in contrast to in Philadelphia, although you might argue with me a little bit on this, but this is not a home front. This is not what we conventionally think of. They're not living in a separate space from combat. They're living in a war zone. And so this family life that's coming together, that's in these camps, these families are experiencing the war together. They're experiencing the transient nature of war, having to pick up and go elsewhere quickly when enemy troops are coming in, or they're experiencing being targeted by enemy troops like Confederate guerrillas in the Mississippi Valley. They're experiencing the disease that's ripping through Army encampments. They're struggling to share resources with the Army. And, maybe sharing is a bit of a stretch when, the soldiers' needs always come first, and, the families, the refugees, they come last. So they're struggling for food, they're struggling for shelter, they're struggling for a place to be. So it's, so there's this common thread of stress on family, although I would say that those in the South were experiencing it in a different way, perhaps.
And thinking about recruiting within these refugee camps, how much of that was willing? How much did some of these men go willingly into the ranks, or was there any ways in which they didn't go so willingly?
Great question. And it's kind of related to what we're talking about here. It's a mix. And, there are, and again, the story that I talk about with these camps, it's very different from place to place. So I always get a little anxious about generalizing, but we do see kind of early on when enlistment gets started that, some of these men who've been working for the Army for a couple years already, they sort of more willingly make the transition into enlistment. And for some of them, it's really not a big leap, because some of them are still doing some of this heavy labor, even as a soldier after they enlist. But then as time moves on, it's a mixed story. So there are always some who voluntarily enlist, but then there are always, some who are thinking that maybe this is not the best thing for them and their family. And so family, is very much a part of the enlistment decision. And why would they not enlist in deference to their family? Well, enlistment means that they're going to be sent off somewhere. They might have to be separated from their family. They don't know for how long or where they're going to be or how far they're going to be apart. And when you think about a population that's coming out of slavery, that has experienced the threat or even the reality of family separation their whole lives and are hoping for something very different in freedom, the prospect of enlisting and being, separated again is not always what everybody is going to embrace. And so there are cases, and I've seen some in Eastern Virginia, of men being forced into the service, essentially being impressed into the service, but forced using physical force to serve, although it got so violent and so bad that the Union did turn around and investigate that whole situation and try to do something about it. But so yeah, I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
Yeah, and that's getting at some of the challenges that these men faced once they got in the ranks. Wondered, Emmanuel, if you might elaborate a bit on, we've made so many references to glory this evening, but we see many of the challenges that the men face. But Emmanuel, could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yes. So, one of them that we've talked about is this issue of pay, and it is a big issue. People like to get their money. and for people who had not had regular access to money, this is really important. The government that said a few years ago you were not citizens now says you can be a soldier. and we're going to pay you. And the idea was that in their mind that they were going to get paid the same amount of money as white Union troops, which was early in the war, $13 a month. But there was a provision that many of these troops didn't know about to deduct money from their check for clothing. And so they really only got $7 a month. And so this is really dramatized in glory. And I think that, this is an important place to take note of sort of what the differences are between Black people. There is no like monolithic Black folk who were serving in these units. But there are certainly two camps or maybe three camps. There are free Blacks who had been born in the South. There are enslaved people who have been born into slavery throughout this country. And then there are these free Black people from the North. And their experiences are different, and how they perceive this issue of pay is going to be different. This deduction is happening in 1863 and into the first half of 1864. The Black newspapers have articles from literate soldiers talking about the pay discrepancy. This is, a hot button issue in the ranks. In June of 1864, the U.S. Congress passes a law to pay everyone equally if they had been free on April 12th, 1861. And obviously, many people were not. I think it's very critical to note that by the end of the war, it's about 180,000 U.S. colored soldiers in the 4 regiments of state troops who were Black. But most of these people had been born in slavery, so they were not free in April 1861. It takes until the spring of 1865 to pass another law that's going to back pay everybody for their service from time of enlistment. And so these conversations play out in the newspaper where some free Blacks in the North are arguing, don't take any money until they pay everyone equally. Whereas some people who are literate and have been born into slavery are like, I just want my money now, whatever money it is, just pay me as soon as possible. Because what Holly is saying is that people have folks that are suffering, whether they are in the North and are free or have moved there to claim their freedom, or whether they are in these refugee camps scattered throughout the South, or whether they're still back on the plantation. And these people have in their mind that they are going to somehow use their money, their free status now as soldiers, to get money back home, wherever that may be in the South. So, I mean, the pay issue is just so huge in 1863, and really until almost the end of the war, which all of us could have another conversation about, using your book, Carrie, as a jumping off point of when did the war end.
So I want to make sure we have a lot of questions that are starting to roll in. I want to make sure that we have time for as many audience questions as we can get. So I do want to ask all of you, I'll put you on the spot and ask you about the Black Virginians in Blue website and what thoughts you might have about potential research projects, how you might use it, any thoughts that you would like to share with us. And whoever wants to start, please just jump in.
I mean, for me, I think it's actually inspiring to see the ways in which you're incorporating student scholarship into it. I think that's something that I would love to see other schools, including mine, do. And I like that you're making, it's family focused, but it's also localized, and it's making more accessible these important stories that I think is really, it's going to do a lot of great. And, for me, it's like, I'm going to read through some of the articles that have been posted and honestly assign them in future courses. So I think I love the digital history component, and just anything that gets more conversations on African-American history, USET, the families, I think to me is phenomenal.
Well, I guess building on that, say, I think it's really offers a great model of that kind of collaborative teaching.
Right.
And involving students in research. And so if you all are interested in cloning this or letting, franchising it, letting some of us sort of adapt this in our states,
Right.
I think there's going to be some interest, and I'm actually kind of serious about that. But one thing that I really like about the project, and I was thinking about what it offers interpretively in thinking about this history, and I'm really struck by how you're shifting our focus from the point of enlistment to the birthplace and thinking, sort of classifying soldiers that way, as Liz Barron talked about last night. And it really strikes me as, important in that it reminds us that enlistment is not the beginning of a soldier's story, but automatically forces us to think about enlistment as embedded in this much bigger story of movement and migration, or as Liz talked about, the Virginia diaspora. And I think that's a really significant kind of interpretive move here, and maybe help us sort of think a little bit more about the place and the meaning of enlistment in a man's life if we are forcing ourselves to kind of really go back to the beginning. So I really appreciate that. And I think that there's a lot of, a lot of conclusions and ideas that can be drawn out of that. So.
And I'll just build on that a bit, Amy, just thinking about how that can shift our understanding of so many aspects of American history. And even if we just drill down on the war, if you were to take even some all white units, a Minnesota regiment, to see where those men had been born, could show some interesting migration and immigration patterns as well.
Yeah, and I was actually surprised to see how much men had moved before the war, and some of it's slave trade, but some of it's not. It's like there's all different reasons why they're moving while still enslaved, and I feel like, oh, there's something there that we haven't fully seen. So I think that's really, really great.
Although Ed Ayers' new project on movement might give us some clues to that too.
I was just going to add, like, having just reread Ed Ayers' stuff, it made me think about the enslaved people, or refugee people who enlist in Pennsylvania regiments. Doing my second book, I'm seeing that Pennsylvania-born USCT soldiers are not representative of most of the Pennsylvania USCT regiments. They're from everywhere else, including international, but Virginia is definitely there. So to me, it's a way to probably talk about their connections to northern regiments. And even Emmanuel, I believe, made this point as well. And Glory does it, in terms of the diversity of where these people are from.
Mhm.
Emmanuel, we'll let you.
Okay. I was just, thinking in to some degree as to what we were just talking about, is this idea of where people are from. And I remember years ago, and unfortunately I can't remember the scholar's name, but I was at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History conference. And a woman was doing research on how people got separated from older generations through the slave trade, as well as, and primarily she was looking at, and I still hope that she's working on this project, the moving of upper South people to the deep South to establish new plantations. So they're taking the healthiest people with them and leaving behind the old people. And in this context, old means generally people over the age of 45. And so as I'm thinking about sort of where these people are from and where other US colored troops are from, and thinking about family and thinking about how Black people, part of what they want out of the end of slavery is to be able to control the access to their family units, where they live, how they worship, where they travel, what they do in their leisure time. I can't help but think, who all have been left behind when we're thinking about the one gentleman we were talking about last night, who the Carter family, big Virginia family, and those of us who live here, it's like the Carters are still indoctrinated into the soil of Virginia. but it's like, but they also are elsewhere, and who else had been left behind when these people were moving.
Mhm.
And I'm also thinking, anyone that knows me well knows that I'm always shouting out about pension records. This idea that we do not know about Black people's stories because many people were illiterate. That is true, but if you look in these pension records, you will find some more stories. You won't find all the answers that you want, regrettably, but you will find some more stories and give more voice to more people. And I'm excited to see that y'all are using that. I cannot wait for the National Archives to reopen. There's some U.S. colored soldiers that I really need their pension for. And I think that hopefully I mean, I've already been on the website and I've already found some troops that served at Petersburg National Battlefield when it was not a national battlefield, but it is now. And I can't wait to sort of, go back out into the field and imagine those people there with all the other people that we sort of talk about in our public programming. And I think that a lot of other historic sites, I saw someone fought at the Battle of Fort Blakely in Alabama. It's a great site in terms of its preservation. I haven't been to it yet, but there are some great opportunities to use these stories out at the places where these people were in their Civil War experience.
Manuel, that is a fantastic idea. And I like the notion of reaching out to various Park Service units and maybe just showing them the website and finding ways of making some connections there. I'm sure there are more stories that we have not yet unearthed, and kind of a two-way street that could go on between the Nau Center and National Park Service. If you guys are ready, would you like to switch to some questions from the audience?
Yep.
And I will just ask these, and unless they are specifically directed to someone, whoever feels the most comfortable, please chime in. So, knowing that regiments from northern states had the ability to form as whole regiments away from embattled areas, how did Virginia's USCT soldiers get enlisted and trained? Maybe thinking about, as opposed to enlisting in Massachusetts, how are units that are raised in either the border states or in Confederacy, but Virginia, but are there units raised in Virginia?
There are units raised in Virginia, and principally, once areas have fallen into spaces that Union troops have control over. So think Northern Virginia, think Norfolk, Hampton Roads, the peninsula, that sort of area. And so for many of those units, there's going to be a center around refugee experiences. So people who have left from interior Virginia and have gone to these Union occupied areas of Virginia. And there are Union regiments, Black US regiments, that are formed at Fort Monroe, one of our somewhat new national park units in Hampton, Virginia. So there are units that are formed in Arlington, because the Union troops have occupied Arlington since the spring of 1861. And so by 1863, there's opportunity for Black men to enlist, and there's already refugee camps in Arlington on the abandoned plantation of the Lee family, as well as in Washington, D.C. Mason's Island, which is now Governor's Island, right there in the Potomac River, is a great location for the enlistment for the first U.S. colored infantry. They're drawing from Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Northern Virginia, and there are people pouring in from Maryland and what's now West Virginia to these spaces. And so they are having the opportunity to enlist and drill and that sort of traditional thing, even within the so-called seceded states, but they are within Union-controlled territory.
Mm-hmm. And just anecdotally, in terms of the training, I can think of examples from Kentucky, which my students have been researching, and the 5th Colored Cavalry, it's within days this one company my class really worked on, within days of, they're mustering in, they are gone, they're off to Saltville. So they just had a few days, basically. I wouldn't say, of course, that's true everywhere, but at times the training was pretty truncated.
Agreed.
So this question is for Holly. What role did William Still and other Philadelphia abolitionist Underground Railroad agents play in the Black wartime mobilization efforts there?
So actually, I just bought that new biography that just came out, so I'm looking forward to reading it. And it actually goes back to a previous point that was being made about the recruitment process in the North, particularly in like Philadelphia, but also I'd say New York City. People realized, whether we're talking Union League Club, whether from New York or from Philadelphia, prominent individuals, that the Black community was going to be, and particularly Black churches, but also Black women, were critical to the recruiting effort. And you see that playing out. And so that's something I really try to push in my research, is that we need to recognize the prominent role that Black women are playing in wartime mobilization in larger northern cities, because they are critical. William D. Kelly actually says during a recruitment campaign that ladies, I'm not going to say exactly how he said it because it's actually really bad, but he's basically acknowledging that it's mothers, it's single women, it's daughters, that you are the ones that are going to be important to getting men to go. And he's using this racial and gendered component. For my work, I was trying to focus more on the family unit, going with this theme that we've been talking about. So taking the focus away from Douglass, from Anna Dickinson, from William Still, from the Fortons, from the Purvises, because their stories have been so, I don't want to say overanalyzed, have been the focus, particularly of Black Philadelphian experiences in the wartime. Having said that, they're without a doubt extremely critical. I would say more work could be done on the Black churches in supporting the war effort and also critiquing it, because even though you have the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass is doing campaigns through the AME churches throughout Philadelphia. And in some places, he actually gets booed out of the building, which I've not seen a lot of people discuss, but there is a little bit of blowback because they're saying, why should these people give their lives, knowing they're not even seen, to Emmanuel's point before, as full citizens? So I think without doubt, William Still, the Purvises, and I mean by that Charlotte, and the Fortons, and Lucretia Mott, because her home actually, part of her family plot will become what is known as Camp William Penn, which I think is really interesting, because while William Still will work as a sutler at Camp William Penn, so he is directly interacting with USCT troops at Camp William Penn, you also have Lucretia Mott, who is going there on a daily basis at some points and interacting with the soldiers and giving them food and watching them drill. So I think, to me, it's really interesting to see the abolitionist networks playing out at these military camps, and even marriages, which I would be interesting to see if William Still's new book, for example, talks about the fact that many civilians came there and formed unions in a military base, and neither of them had connections to the regiment. So I think military camps, whether we're talking with Amy's work or others, or even the Freeborn, that there's so much that's happening in these camps that can be analyzed, including the role of prominent abolitionists, male and female.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just tag on to Holly's point that one of the most amazing Black Philadelphians was the artist David Bowser,
Yes,
who painted 11 regimental flags, the regimental banner, not the US flag. And unfortunately, most of them were thrown out in about 1940 or so by the War Department. And so we lost a critical element of that connection between someone who is talented, who is an advocate for Black people, men and women, who is an abolitionist to this point it was brought up. And like many people, I'm sure, in this conversation, in listening, know whose talents were not appreciated then. And the only thing that we're largely left with now is photographs of those banners.
And I just add, Jacob C. White Jr. is another individual who's connected to this, because he's part of the Institute for Colored Youth, but he also knows David Bowser. And actually, it's African-American women that raised the money for some of those regimental flags that are used for the Pennsylvania USCT regiments, which further emphasizes how prominent and important the Black women were in the movement. And also, it's just, there's no way you can't talk about these figures and the wartime and USCTs. They're there. They're supporting, they're critiquing the military, they're critiquing the federal government, they're advocating for change, and it's amazing.
We have another question. Persons classified as contraband were enlisted in the Navy as first-class boys as early as September 1861. Why do you think it took the Army so long to enlist Black men?
Amy, you want to go first?
Well, if somebody else wants to go, I bet Emmanuel does.
Yeah.
I didn't study the Navy, so whenever the Navy comes into this,
Run away.
I don't know. I'm biased. I'm the child of my mother served in the Navy, so I'm always going to say yay Navy. I mean, Stephen Ramrold has done work on this, I know, with some of his work, and I mean, my limited, and I'm going to be honest, like Amy said, Emmanuel, like my limited understanding of it is that the U.S. Navy was more in, I'm saying, well, it was definitely more inclusive early on than the United States Army, and a number of Northern soldiers in New York and Pennsylvania, so the 20th, 26th, 31st, the 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th, some of them actually served in the U.S. Navy, and then afterwards immediately go in to serve in the USCT regiments. So there is actually some connections between that. The motivations to serve in the USCT obviously differ, but there is some connections that someone else, with the new project could delve into much better than I'm even explaining.
So Emmanuel, that was you.
With, quick, yeah. I'm just gonna say that from the beginning, from the American Revolution, Black people have served this country, whether they were recognized for their work or not. The Navy has always had a different approach to their needs. And I think that's because they were just early on, pre-Civil War, the Navy is not very big. And so as they sort of drop into other localities around the world, it's like, hey, I want to work. Oh, we don't have anybody because these people are sick, or people are sick and they died. People have deserted. And so sure, we'll take somebody from Spain, we'll pick up people, in the Caribbean, who we are not asking whether they are free or whether they're enslaved or they're runaways. Just nothing is sort of being asked. And so this seems to become a part of the early Navy culture that continued early in the Civil War. And so, you see these people, to this questioner's point, that are serving in the Navy, first class boy, second class boy, third class boy. They're working, on ships, and the Navy is open to it. The Army is closed off to many of those folks. And I think it is an important note that, Abraham Lincoln has chosen this diverse cabinet of people who do not have the same political points of view, and the War Department is headed by a Democrat. And so Edwin Stanton is not, like Mr. Abolitionist. Of course, neither is Abraham Lincoln, but Lincoln more so than Edwin Stanton early on. And the war, in the twists and turns of the war, and so much of this centers on the Black refugee experience, will force both the Army and the Navy to just welcome whomever they can reasonably get that's in good condition to carry out something that, definitely in 1861 was not perceived by either side to extend over the breadth of space that it did and the length of time that it did.
And just to build on that quickly, Black men were important sailors on civilian ships before the war as well. And, that even becomes a political issue in South Carolina when they don't want, these free Black sailors disembarking. So, we can see the enlistment in the Navy as kind of a continuation of what you've been talking about, Emmanuel, but also this, civilian position as sailors as well. And that's something that's a bit unique from serving in the Army.
Another question is, did Black men ever serve as surgeons in the USCT?
Yes, there are some Black officers during the war. Most of them are chaplains, and there are a few surgeons. And by some officers, I mean there's like 14 in the entirety of the United States Army. So we're not talking about a lot, and this is very much centered on racialized ideology that still, was there with the Lincoln administration. That Black people are not as intelligent in many of their views to be officers on the field, to be surgeons who get sent out into the field. And so you get a variety of people who the white officers who are with these regiments taking care of people who even at times those white officers don't really support. But what we see is, when there are Black surgeons, they tend to be well behind the front lines, where the fighting is happening, and in cities, large urban areas like Washington, D.C., working with Black troops and the refugees who also end up in these hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
Holly, this question is for you in regard to glory. What is your take on the depiction of freeborn Thomas as, at least initially, kind of a soft touch as compared to Private Tripp or Sergeant Rollins being shown as tougher and more masculine? What does this tell us about popular conceptions of free versus enslaved African Americans in the 19th century? And do you find the depictions problematic?
That's it. That last part, that's where it got me. So I guess it's the quickest, simplest way is I have a lot of problems with the movie, right? Having said that, I will always use it as a teaching source because unfortunately, there isn't many other depictions out there, or it's like piecemealed in other, like Roots, for example, right? Like I might be able to piecemeal some of the experiences. But Thomas, in the people that I studied for my dissertation and for this first book, is not representative of the Philadelphian African-American experience. Many are working poor, and they're everyone in their homes, including fictive kin, are critical in providing resources, whether that's through money or contributions, to keep their homes stable. It's not to say they're not literate, but they're not affluent. And Thomas's character, at least the depiction, makes it seem like, at least in my opinion, which many can differ with, is that he's he's highly educated. He went to a private institution that gave him knowledge in the class. But basically, and I keep coming back to the Institute for Colored Youth because it's from Philly, but learning Greek, learning Latin, learning mathematics, like highly intellectual young man. But that's not necessarily going to be representative of the Black experience. I, in some ways, see each character, each person in Glory as trying to represent what Ed Zwick and the movie is doing, and like these are the types of soldiers. Tripp is also a type of soldier. I think there could be more on young boys, particularly some of the people I study. They're the only ones making money for their entire household. Andrew White, for example, is someone I study. He'll die at the Battle of Alesti. And before he dies, he's been writing his mother on the front line saying, I just want to go to battle. I just want to see the Confederates. Every time we see them, they run away, right? And he keeps bringing about it through a gendered component. Before the war, he was the only person working full-time and earning a wage for his family. He will get his wish and die in battle. And that completely destroys his family's economic stability. And he was not literate. He worked 2 jobs. He was a wagon driver, I believe, and a laborer. And he was critical to his entire family, particularly because his stepfather was unable to work before he enlisted. So it's like, these are the kinds of stories and people I want to highlight or even if we go with Thomas and Tripp, who are Thomas's family members? Who did Thomas live with? Who was Thomas in a relationship? If Thomas went to church, where did he go? Who's worried about him? Because Thomas's character, at least from the way I see him, he's clearly would have been writing home to someone about his experiences, the struggle he's having, even with the people he serves with, which is one thing that, to Emmanuel's point, the film does really good. The divisions within the Black soldiers, you see that in military discharge, court-martial records. There's theft, there's divisions, there's politics going on over certain soldiers see themselves as better or different than those who were enslaved or were free or were wealthy. So I think it's, in short, Glory's phenomenal. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. You'll probably cry like I do. There's always the campfire scene. I will lose it because I'm sorry. It's like, because I know what's happening to them before they go into that battle. Having said that, I would encourage you to read the multitude of scholarship that's out there that goes deeper into who these people were and think about it from the context of the family. Like I said, thinking about Dr. Varen's conversation yesterday, for example, I was thinking about what does it mean for these people as fathers, sons, brothers, members of a community.
Thank you. That's actually a perfect way, I think, to end our conversation. Thank you to Amy, to Emmanuel, to Holly for joining us this evening. I'm sorry for all of the questions that came in. We had so many questions, and despite my best efforts, we didn't have time to get to all of them. Please feel free to email the Nau Center if you have some questions that you would like us to try to answer for you. And thank you all again for joining us for this launch. If you haven't checked out the website yet, please do so. And we hope to see you again at a future program in the very near future, hopefully in person. So good night, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Night.
Thanks.